The means were used for healing them, but they would not be healed. Yea, they cast some of us out because we used such means. Therefore we are obliged to leave them, and to go out from ecclesiastical communion with them. The testimony against them being now lifted up in a way of secession from them, it is another call given unto them to return to the Lord, to remember from whence they have fallen, and to repent. This call was intimate unto them in a very public and solemn manner. When the Associate Presbytery did read their act and declinature in presence of the Assembly, 1739. But if the present judicatories will still continue to justify themselves in their iniquities and backslidings, both we and the whole land have ground to fear that a righteous and holy God may be provoked to say, Shall I not visit for these things? The above-mentioned protestation for exoneration bears that the protesting ministers had a very great regard for the judicatories of this church. Therefore, Mr. Currie argues in the Vindication on page 157 that if the said ministers had a very great regard for the judicatory at that time, then there was no ground for secession from the established church when the said protestation was entered. But from what I have observed in the preceding second chapter, and from what is hinted above, the judicious reader may see how little weight there is in Mr. Currie's argument. There is one thing that Mr. Currie should observe comes into the argument for secession from the present judicatories, which he always slips over, and that is their obstinate refusal of all the means that were used to reclaim them, which they did manifestly discover in thrusting the protesting ministers out from them, merely for a protestation for exoneration, and for their refusing to retract the same. And the judicatories have not to this day condemned this iniquity, nay, so far from it, that the Assembly 1734, in their remit to the Synod of Perth, bind up the said synod from judging of the legality or formality of the proceedings of the judicatories in relation to the protesting ministers, and from approving or censuring the same. Mr. Currie continues likewise to harp upon some expressions contained in one of our representations given into the commission, August 1733. The expressions are, quote, Why our mother's sons are so very angry with us as to threaten to cast us out of the Lord's vineyard, unquote. Says Mr. Currie, if she was then the Lord's vineyard, notwithstanding of the Act 1733 and all her other faults, she is not worse now than she was then. Vindication, page 159. Such reasonings appear to me not to deserve any notice. I can safely say the Assembly 1740 have done what lies in their power to cast the seceding ministers out of the Lord's vineyard. Yet it will never follow that, by saying so, I acknowledge the present judicatories to be lawful and right constituted courts of Christ. Mr. Currie, from his above-mentioned or the like reasonings, tells his reader in the Vindication on page 157, quote, that to him it is clear to a demonstration that, for all the faults of the judicatories, the brethren had never thought of a secession, had not the Assembly actually cast some of them out, unquote. Upon which I observe, to me it is very clear that Mr. Currie is too daring and bold when he determines that the brethren would never have thought upon a secession except in the event mentioned. I humbly judge that to determine what men's thoughts would have been, or would not have been, upon any supposed event, is the prerogative of him who only knows all things in himself that are either possible or future. Although I will not take it upon me to determine what the thoughts of the brethren would have been, in case the event mentioned had not fallen out, yet I judge there was too much ground given for a secession from the present judicatories before the brethren were actually cast out, as I have observed in the introduction to the defense. Likewise I'll venture to say that the ejection of the brethren, an event which came to such a narrow point as the moderator's casting vote, though in itself a very wicked and sinful deed, yet it has been, according to the wise counsel and purpose of him who worketh all things according to providence, overruled to such good ends and purposes, which it is very probable neither the present judicatories nor the protesting ministers had thought upon, and amongst others it has brought help and relief to several of the Lord's scattered flock, and heritage through the land. It has likewise brought forth a judicial testimony to Scotland's covenanted Reformation against a manifest course of defection from the same. Mr. Currie, having in his essay on page 6 told his readers that he hopes that the judicatories are not vastly worse since the year 1733, when the brethren entered their protestation for exoneration against the deed of assembly the said year. Therefore, in Defense, Chapter 2, Section 6, I give several instances to show that since the foresaid time, the judicatories, by their proceedings and conduct, or vastly worse, and that, instead of showing a disposition for removing the grounds of secession, they do from time increase and strengthen the same. Two of the instances which I give did take place immediately after the foresaid protestation was entered, and other instances which I give have taken place since the secession was declared. Since Mr. Currie makes some exceptions unto the instances which I give, I shall only take notice of 2 or 3 of them and show how little ground there is for the exceptions Mr. Currie makes against them. The first 2 instances I give, to show that the judicatories were worse after the protestation against the Assembly 1733 was entered, are the act and sentence of the said Assembly against the protesting ministers, and the arbitrary execution of the same by their commission. Upon the foresaid act and sentence passed by the Assembly, defense, page 159, I say, quote, I doubt if Mr. Currie shall find a parallel to this extraordinary sentence since our Reformation from Popery, whereby 4 ministers were thrust out from the commission with the judicatories on account of a protestation of their just and necessary exoneration, unquote. Upon this, says Mr. Currie, in the Vindication, page 160, quote, if Mr. Wilson's memory has failed him in this, he may remember what I doubt not he knew before, namely, that in 1651, which was nearly 100 years after our Reformation from Popery, the Assembly at Dundee did not only suspend or cast out, but actually depose 4 worthy ministers for protesting against that Assembly, etc., unquote. But I doubt not that Mr. Currie knows very well that the ministers who were deposed in 1651 were not deposed for a protestation for exoneration, as was the case in 1733, but they were deposed for a protestation and declinature disowning the authority of the Constitution of the said Assembly. I have given instances in the defense that Mr. Currie sometimes disguises matters of fact, and this is another instance of this kind. The case above mentioned in the year 1651 is quite different from the case 1733, and I still affirm that Mr. Currie cannot give a parallel to the conduct of the present judicatories since our Reformation. There was never such an act of tyranny exercised whereby 4 ministers were thrust out from ministerial communion merely for a protestation for exoneration. The worthy ministers who were deposed in the year 1651 were deposed for declining the authority of a pretended assembly at Dundee, and in this respect the case was parallel unto the case of the seceding brethren in the year 1739. But with this difference, that the declinature in the foresaid year was a judicial act indeed, whereas that in the year 1651 was an extrajudicial deed. I may also add that the declinature in 1739 was upon a broader foundation and ground than that in the year 1651. However, from the practice of the worthy ministers in the year 1651, one of whom died a martyr for our covenanted principles, that is, Mr. James Guthrie, we may see that it is not unprecedented in this church to decline the authority and disown the constitution of such assemblies as are not constitute in a right and lawful manner. We may also see a precedent for such ministers continuing in the exercise of the office of the ministry who are suspended, cast out, or deposed by pretended assemblies. The other instances I give, that the present judicatories are much worse in their conduct and procedure, have taken place since the secession was declared November 1733. Particularly, in the defense, page 160, they're continuing to authorize, support, or countenance the violent settlement of ministers, either upon the footing of the Patronage Act or the repealed Act 1732. I give several examples of this. Though Mr. Currie continues to justify his assertions, that is, that some stop has been put to violent intrusions, and that a considerable stop has been put to them for some time bygone, essay page 6 and page 30, yet he cannot refuse that several of the instances I mentioned are such, whereby violent intrusions were either authorized, countenanced, or supported. But as to some others of them he affirms in the Vindication, page 161, that there was no violent intrusion in the case, particularly the settlement of the parish of Perth with Mr. David Black. This settlement I reckon among the violent settlements, the defense, page 161, where I assert, quote, that it was upon the footing of the Act 1732, when the majority of the elders were dissenting from the said settlement, and a constitute secession, reclaiming against the same before all the judicatories of the church, unquote. But, says Mr. Currie, quote, it was no violent intrusion, though there was the small majority of 1 elder against it, unquote. But in this, Mr. Currie is misinformed, for there were 14 elders against it, and only 12 for it. Consequently, there was a majority of 2 elders. Likewise, the session, being orderly and regularly met, One of the ministers did always preside in their determinations and resolutions against the said settlement. Another reason Mr. Currie gives to show that this settlement at Perth was not a violent intrusion is that according to his information, quote, to balance the foresaid small majority of elders against Mr. Black's call, there was a majority of 16 of the magistracy and council for the same, and likewise, beside the heritors not of our communion, there was a majority of heritors not for it, unquote. And therefore he does not reckon it a violent intrusion. But then, according to Mr. Currie's information, Mr. Black's call was purely upon the footing of the Act 1732, and if Mr. Currie is consistent with himself in his former writings, he will never make it appear that a settlement purely upon the footing of the Act 1732 is not a violent settlement. Mr. Currie adds, quote, there may be a majority of the elders against a call, and yet the person called have God's call and his people's, unquote. But this is nothing to the present purpose. In regard, I may upon as good ground say that there may be a majority of a town council and heritors for a call, yet the person called want God's call and his people's. And if Mr. Currie is consistent with himself in his former writings, he cannot refuse this.